Thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Joseph, for inviting me, and the Confucius Institute for hosting, and bringing me here and making everything work. I haven't been to the Michigan campus in many years, and so it's nice to be back. Is my sound okay?
Yes.
Okay. And I have a glass of water in case I start fuzzing out. So, I have a long-running interest in what we might call late Imperial Chinese personal prose, the sort of writing where people write about their own pasts and pastimes, and their childhoods and aesthetic experiences and relatives and dreams and anxieties and eccentricities and all that sort of thing. And my book on Zhang Dai's Dream Reminiscences of Taoan was part of that interest. I really wanted to understand the functions and the poetics and the power of the sort of brief vignettes that Zhang Dai is so famous for. And then I wrote another article a few years ago on the architectural housing of personal memory in late Imperial prose, in which I examined how architectural detail, which is usually not very visible in Chinese prose, played an important role sometimes in framing particularly vivid foundational personal memories, especially those from youth or traumatic events. And I kind of liked the article, but I kind of felt like I left it floating out there by itself, and it made more sense, it would make more sense if there were other, if I looked at some other possible framings for this kind of thing. And so today's project is a kind of an experiment along those lines. In that previous article, I began with the notion that since we don't actually remember our conjecturally continuous selves in their entirety, we use a kind of working model of a self, a kind of a metaphorical self that's implied by pieces to which we give special significance. If you think back on your childhood, I'm sure you can pick some of those out that you keep returning to. I looked at how Guiyou Guang's memory of his grandmother's hopes for him was framed in a little essay he wrote in a particular doorway of what would later become his studio, and how the 18th century Manchu memoirist Lin Qing, how his early education was fixed by a magical little moment one night in the courtyard of the schoolroom where he was studying as a boy, when glittering pills, as he put it, descended from the sky. These are the smallest frames, fragile and unknown to others. In the workings of memory, they function by housing those core fragments of the metaphor. Today, I want to consider the other pole, one of the largest frames of personal memory, and I'm going to try to approach that through Zhang Han's松窗梦语, or Dream Talk by the Pine Window, which Zhang completed right before his death at the age of 83. Zhang was born in 1510. He was a native of Hangzhou. He was from a family of textile weavers. He became a jinshi in 1535, and in his long official career was supervisor of the Longjiang shipyards in Nanjing. He held various posts in the Ministry of Justice in Beijing and served in Shaanxi, Fujian, Guangdong, Sichuan, several times at the level of governor. So he was a fairly notable official. And by the time he sat down to write, or at least pull together the松窗梦语, the Pine Window, he'd seen a lot. So, 松窗梦语 is a curious work, somewhat hard to classify. And so let me begin then by the way in which I encountered it. It was one of those discoveries that the not-so-organized make. In this case, it was a discovery I made in my living room while looking for something else. And there was this little volume I didn't remember buying for $2.50 at the Oriental Culture Enterprise. Was that in San Francisco when I was a grad student? $2.50, I could have afforded it, so that's probably what it was. And so I opened it and I skimmed the author's preface, which, if perhaps not the most imaginative piece of late Ming prose, still has a certain charm and eloquence to it. And so I'm going to read a translation of it. Since I retired and returned home, I have ceased to have contact with the worldly dust and confined myself to a small loft. Beyond its pillars is a pine tree transplanted from Tianmu, its dragon trunk extending upwards and sideways, its kingfisher feathers densely clustered, luxurious and verdant, unchanging through the 4 seasons, possessed of a bearing that holds the dew and receives the rain, and a regulated nature that endures the frost and disdains the snow. Day and night I sit facing it, my gaze never leaving it, sometimes quietly meditating on the past. Matters from some 4 or 5 years ago glitter as in a dream. The memories swirl in a tangle, and my 100 feelings all turn to past traces. It's said that the past is dream illusion, while this present moment is but a temporary wakening. Henceforth, how can one know that some other time's recollection of today will not be like our present recollection of the past? Dreaming of joy, one is joyful. Dreaming of sadness, one is sad. Having woken and encountered sadness and joy, one is again sad and joyful. How can one know that the time in dream was not really waking, and that one's waking hours are not really dream? I spend long days at the pine window, writing things out as the brush goes, partly to examine into myself, and partly to pass down to those who come after me. All right, there's a lot of convention here. The pine tree, emblematic of the steadfast official of integrity who weathers all winters. The musing on dream that is indebted to passages in Zhuangzi, including the famous butterfly dream passage. Comparing the view of the past to an ambiguous dream state was commonplace by this time. But the trope still had its truthfulness and would retain its power for those a half-century later who would watch the Ming dynasty fall. And clearly in his preface, Zhang Han is asking us to read his book as one person's wavering memories of a past personally known, because the book is supposed to serve the twin functions of an examination into self and something of himself, maybe, that can be passed down to the people who come after him. Zhang doesn't say what sort of later people he might have in mind. Is it his sons, his descendants, a broader readership? But from his description of writing things out as the brush goes, 随笔述事, it seems the book probably falls under the more modern and conveniently loose, baggy category of biji, or brush jottings, or notebook, note literature, a term that on the surface purposely tells us little beyond that such works were recorded with a brush. It's a term whose definition is partly negative, a form that seems to fall outside of the defining characteristics of other forms. biji can be enormous or small. They can include entries on myriad topics or only one. And they often exhibit a charming or maddening, depending on your purpose, lack of organization. Some biji are best described as stuff. But even in those cases, it's stuff that has been brought together by one mind and thus would seem to have a potential to stand as a tracing of the motions of that mind. Maybe not quite the introspective manner of Montaigne's essays, but not entirely unrelated. Okay, after the preface, one comes to the table of contents, and this is what I gave you. And this is where I was really struck, unprepared for the sheer structure of the thing. Clearly, Zhang Han was either a very organized man, or he had a very organized brush that he was following. The table of contents starts with rovings of a government official, but it quickly heads into geographically systematic mapping of the empire, south, north, east, west. And this is followed by sections on what we would now call ethnic minority peoples of each of those regions. In the fourth Zhen, or sort of chapter section, we are introduced to some outstanding officials of the Jiangsu Zhejiang area where he was from, and then are presented with treatises on agriculture, various crafts, artisans, commerce. And at this point I'm wondering how this might constitute an examination into self. Doesn't really look like it. Gen 5 tours the cosmos, sun, moon, planets, heaven and earth, which is really geomancy, feng shui, auspiciousness, natural disasters, unusual occurrences, and this juxtaposition of planets and unusual occurrences and auspiciousness reminds us that there's a kind of an astrological component running through all of that material. And then we return to the terrestrial realm for what looks like an ambitious tour of flora and fauna. It's pretty comprehensive. This all seems admirably comprehensive, but it's somewhat at odds in a way with the impression one gets from the preface. The remaining 3 Zhen are something more of a hodgepodge. Occult techniques or recipes, unusual things heard, dreams while sleeping, power, seasons, customs, self-examination. Ooh, there it is. Chapter 29 of 33, self-examination. Ministry of personnel, grain transport. One wonders if whatever model of organization Zhang Han started with had drawn to a close with a lot of raw materials still left over. I have to ask, what is dreams while sleeping doing between previous generations and power? But the structural curiosities go well beyond that. So try for a moment to align the preface with the table of contents. We have a book that systematically presents material, sometimes in treatise forms, a treatise on commerce, for instance, on the regions and the peoples of the 4 points of the compass, on the major livelihoods, as well as the universe at large, and flora and fauna. But it also includes sections of anecdotes the author recalls from his migratory life as an official, as well as his dreams. And it's supposed to represent a look inward, presumably at maybe his moral being, as well as something to hand down. One wonders if it is a sense of the man himself that he is trying to hand down to his descendants, in which case the treatises are a bit hard to explain, or a fairly comprehensive education for young men of the future, in which case his dreams seem somewhat out of place. And so I found myself staring at the table of contents and asking the question I ask of a lot of texts. What is this? What are its functions? How does it seem to work? And in keeping with my original line of thought, what sort of frameworks are holding Zhang Han's memories here, and what do they do to the rememberer that they frame? I've actually always loved the unpredictability of biji. But because I come at them from a literary point of view, which is to say I want to know how they function, how their rhetoric works, how a person is embedded in them, I like a lot of people, I'm often frustrated by how they are presented in modern editions, which is usually as useful grist for historians. It's instructive to breeze through a part of editor Sheng Dongling's preface to the 1985 Zhonghua Shuju edition of it. It's sort of as a picture of this sort of attitude. So I'll just give you pieces. The section on travels as an official records his dealings during the period in which he was serving in various official positions. The records of the southern, northern, eastern, and western travels record the sites and customs of those places. The record of the western travels gives accounts of the numbers and distribution of salt, oil, and natural gas wells in Sichuan, and those are of great value. The records of the northern Lu and the western Fan peoples relate the governmental relations between the Ming court and the minority peoples of the north and west. And on he goes. And then when he starts talking about the bottom, when it comes to the 2 records on flora and fauna, they record the carefree leisure of raising plants and animals, and that on prior generations eulogizes the meritorious virtue of Zhang's ancestors. And in the record of examination into self, Zhang himself sets down written evaluations. Looking at these today, they are not of any great significance. I thought they sounded kind of interesting. The sections on sun, moon, and planets, heaven and earth, auspicious omens, natural disasters, unusual occurrences, occult techniques, and all those things, dreams, propagate superstitions, their language going over into the preposterous, and furthermore, they mix in a lot of dross. Although we can, in those records, glimpse something of the psychological condition and mental outlook of the typical scholar of the time. Okay, so I guess I always find myself drawn to the dross and the psychological, underpinnings of the person of the time, because I was kind of heading for those parts. Now, granted, this is an introduction from edition. It's part of a series on historical source material, so it's perhaps unfair to criticize the editor for sticking to the ways in which the text is useful in those ways. But by now we can see that editor Sheng is doing something fairly common, thinking of this kind of work as something that we can use to construct a picture of Ming history, and not thinking of all the work that Zhang Han put into selecting and structuring his knowledge. But it happens to be Zhang Han's structures, not to mention all those auspicious omens and unusual occurrences and dreams and fascinating bits of dross, that interest me because they're very suggestive of how he constructed his place in the world, and thus of how he, the experienced high official who came to possess all this knowledge, wanted us to receive the knower. That always interests me. As the editor's preface indicates, the松窗梦语seems to be an example of a particular type of biji, the jianwan, or things seen and heard biji. Cong Ellen Zhang, who's at the University of Virginia, has analyzed a whole lot of this kind of jianwan, things seen and heard biji, from the Song dynasty, so earlier, and she sees in them a sense that Song writers, especially well-traveled but not particularly well-known ones, seem to form a reading and writing community of things seen and heard knowledge. As she puts it, they celebrate the role of extensive travel and social gathering and personal exploration in transforming themselves into erudite scholars of miscellaneous knowledge. I'd kind of like to be an erudite scholar of miscellaneous knowledge. Behind this, she sees the twin concepts of investigating things and preserving, in the tradition of unofficial histories, the events and knowledge that would otherwise have escaped historians. Both she and Peter Boll suggest that with increased travel and publishing in the Song dynasty, knowledge was becoming more decentralized, no longer linked to texts that emanated from a centralized source. Boll sees in these things seen and heard biji a Song intellectual reassertion of the value of the phenomenal world. In many ways, this sounds rather like the松窗梦语. The emphasis on particular knowledge gained through travel, anecdotes that have the potential to fill in the historical record, and perhaps even an audience of low-level or new officials and staffs that aided them. But there also seem to be important differences. When Cong Ellen Zhang looks at the prefaces to those kinds of texts, she ends up pulling out terms that seem to show up often. Erudition, laughter and conversations, the importance of miscellaneous knowledge, things seen and heard, the desire not to forget, leisure. It's worth noting that none of those phrases appears in Zhang Han's preface, although you could argue that some of them are sort of implied. Zhang Han's preface seems to avoid the air of flitting informality that references to leisure and laughter and conversation and miscellaneous knowledge would carry. Instead, his preface depends more on the trope of dream, which had become ubiquitous in the Ming, And while on the surface dream might seem wafty and undisciplined, it sometimes did carry the more profound sense that if both the past and we are dream, then perhaps through that mysterious way in which dream links us to other places and times, including those of the dead, perhaps it can grant us access to the past in its entirety, rather than just in fragments. In other words, it has the potential to be fuller than memory. More importantly, the contents of the Jianwan biji from the Song were generally not organized. As Peter Bowles put it, these things draw attention back to the diversity and particularity of actual phenomena and experience and contradict the politicians and philosophers who believe they could understand history, the classics, and man's relation to the cosmos in some systematic way. Bowles sees biji as both asserting the unity of heaven and man and as highlighting the seeming impossibility of apprehending it in all the myriad particulars that present themselves to us. Much of the松窗梦语doesn't seem to quite fit that picture. First of all, it is highly organized. Look at that table of contents. And in a manner that seems to assert rather than deny the knowability of the whole of empire and man in the cosmos. All of Zhang Han's collected bits of knowledge feed into a framework that implies order. Until we get to the bottom, then it's not so clear. The result does not look like a work that distrusts our ability to understand history, the classics, and man's relations to the cosmos in a systematic way. It seems to be sort of reaching for that. In fact, when we look at that table of contents, it resembles not so much a bucket of miscellaneous knowledge as an encyclopedia. A compilation that seeks to make knowledge accessible and to integrate it into existing conceptual structures by categorizing the entries by content. And indeed, there was in the Song and especially the Ming an explosion of encyclopedias of various sorts, often cranked out by publishing houses in endlessly revised editions. Most consisted of excerpts of existing texts, and most contained no original material at all. A lot of work has recently been done on these 日用类书 or daily use encyclopedias, which included all manner of handy information about writing contracts, basic mathematics, marvelous party tricks. They're fascinating. But that seems like a whole different thing from what Zhang Han is doing here. On the other hand, Hilde de Wert's description of what she calls the encyclopedia as textbook in the 12th and 13th century seems much closer. And this was helpful to me because I didn't actually know much about this kind of encyclopedia. She sees a type of category book, a leishu, that tried to fill the widening gap between the flood of students aiming to take the civil service exams and the education system which was unable to keep up. So most of these encyclopedia textbooks consisted of primary text accompanied by analytical essays, and were often produced by teachers, sometimes with the help of their students, and were used in the education system. De Wert points out that in the 12th and 13th century, the area of modern Zhejiang and Jiangsu in particular produced a lot of these, and that's exactly where Zhang Han is from. I don't know how familiar he was with them, and his is not set up with primary texts and accompanying essays. It's just him writing. But it does seem possible there was a little bit of an influence there when he sat down to think, how am I going to write all this stuff down that I want to write down? It's hard to do that. You need some sort of a form. Okay. Before I go any further, let's look at the contents a little bit more closely. And here again, I hear Peter Bowles' voice as he points out that while biji can be a collection of items in a format that does not easily lend itself to a point. I like that description. It nonetheless could serve many functions for its author. And so this is a text that's doing many things. I'm sort of focusing on one. So let's begin at the beginning with the section on travels or roaming as an official. Here, instead of neat sort of diary of his travels, we get anecdotes from his years as an official. Some of them center on him, others on other people he knew and observed. And together they seem to form a kind of a double picture of officialdom as it is and officialdom as it should be, and inevitably those two don't necessarily coincide. So here are three little anecdotes from Zhang Han's time as the prefect of Luzhou in what is now Anhui. The first I'll translate, the second and third I'll just describe. But the first is kind of fun. In the summer of 1545 at Luoyang, in the summer of 1545, Luoyang suffered a drought. I fasted. Remember, he's the prefect, so he's responsible for solving these problems. I fasted, donned plain white clothes, and walked out to the altar in the suburbs. After 7 days of prayers, it still hadn't rained. I spoke to the assembled elders, saying, "My prayers aren't answered. That means there are no gods. Gather firewood immediately and collect all those images of gods that you've set up and burn them. If it doesn't rain tomorrow, this magistrate will burn himself too." Administrator Chen Ru came forward at that point and said in consternation, "Don't speak so hastily." I replied, "One body is not worth cherishing. What I cherish is the thousands of people who have no way of supporting their lives." Chen said, "I know you take the people's fate seriously, but for the moment, let's just delay a few more days." So Chen and I once more set out for home on foot under the fierce sun. Before we had reached the city walls, black clouds arose on all sides and great thunderclaps boomed. We stopped in the hall for the prefectural office, and a great rain poured down. Chen composed a record of happy rain and entered it into the prefectural records. That's it. The second anecdote, he talks about land use. In times of starvation and famine, people would abandon their fields and go elsewhere to try and find food. And this was a problem because it disrupted the tax base, and then there was this problem of who does what with what piece of land. And so he comes up with this system where neighbors could till the land that had been abandoned, and if the owner returned within a year, the tillers could charge him labor and expenses, and the two parties would split the harvest. If the owner returned after 2 years, the tillers only turned over a third of the harvest. If the owner returned after 3 years, they only gave a quarter of the harvest to the owner. And after 3 years, the tillers were allowed to keep the land, and the previous owners were only given uncleared land somewhere else. And then in the third one, he describes how the place, Luoyang, had decent land, but people didn't save up for bad years, which is always a problem. So when bad years came, they had to leave to find food elsewhere, and so he wandered around and instructed people on how to dig ponds in low places and build dams in high ones for better irrigation. And so the result was better irrigation and for crops, and also fish and shrimp ponds. And so everybody did better, and when he left, the people all bowed in thanks, and he said, "This is my duty as governor. It's just my job." Okay, so read together, these three adjacent passages convey a lot about Zhang Han, the person in action, his model devotion to the well-being of the common people, his imaginative use of his administrative powers and the available technology to solve long-standing problems, his willingness to sacrifice himself. But the incident about praying for rain is so fascinatingly ambiguous. He leaves off without hinting at what we're supposed to see in it, other than his devotion. He seems skeptical about religion, burn all those useless images of gods? Or is it that he's skeptical of his own worth as an official if he's not able to solve the problem? Is he sincere in his prayers? Or is he put up to them by the prevailing views of the community? They should work in theory, but if they don't, is it a sign of his moral deficiency? And what about the rain after he leaves the altar? Does it speak to his success or to heaven's indifference? He doesn't speculate. Somewhere there's a what could be an examination into one's moral self, but he doesn't quite do that. Even the knowledge of the unity of one man and heaven here seems beyond reach. And so we're left with the next best thing: managerial adroitness born of a combination of resourcefulness and devotion. Not a bad thing. And a fine portrait to pass down to his descendants or other potential officials he need to know how to approach their jobs. Or perhaps even to potential local administrators he need to know that they might now and then have to throw themselves between a capable prefect and a bonfire. Who would have thought? It's good to be prepared. So much of roaming as an official does seem like it would be handy for those sort of entry-level officials. And it does seem a good picture of one man's moral embodiment of that public role. Okay, moving on to accounts of travels to the West. I just picked this one sort of randomly because I was kind of curious what he would talk about. Largely, it's an account of how in 1559 he traveled west to take up a post in Sichuan. And so I went by boat from Wulin along the Taoxi River, and from there went by land. I passed into White Cloud Nunnery, and then from the cities of Ningguo and Shizhou I crossed blah, 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 blah. He just goes, it's an itinerary. I went from here to here to here to here to here. Passing through the ancient Yunmeng marshes in what is now Chengqian province, then Xianling presents itself. I paid my respects and crossed the Xiang River, leaving a poem to mourn Quyuan. I arrived at Jingzhou and went to this place, this waterfall, the stream that galloped like thunder, an extraordinary sight. I crossed the Yu River and I went to the Jade Spring Temple. Behind the temple is a mountain, gloomy with vegetation looping around either side. One is faced with a babbling stream. Going into the temple, one even more wishes not to forget to leave. The whole scene is very beautiful. And it goes on and on like this. Aside from the initial mention of the year and one use of the pronoun I, there's little of the traveler and much of the geography here. And that's really quite typical of a lot of Ming Dynasty geographical writing. And I noticed that he doesn't tell us who is buried at Xianling, or that the Chu kings were buried at Yiling. We're supposed to know those things. So it's not kind of an introduction to the area for people who don't know what's there. But as the sentences roll by, since literary Chinese can easily go for long stretches without using a pronoun, the sense of I went from here to there begins to blur into one goes from here to there. And there are few musings to interrupt that slide into the impersonal. Yes, he tells us that he pauses to pay respect, so that's one. But even when he says that he even more wished to forget to leave after seeing the inside of the temple, that could just as easily be one wishes to forget to leave. So what happens is kind of interesting. A lot of times, sometimes in these kind of travel diaries, people will get very specific. They'll get to a place and they'll say, and then I had to scramble up this hillside and there was a notch and I put my left foot in the notch and I grabbed the tree branch and I managed to get up to the top. And so they're sort of bodily present there. He doesn't do that. You don't have any sense of him, body there struggling to go through this. We don't even really know is he with other people, presumably. So The effect then is that Zhang Han, the official en route to specific official posts, begins to blend into the geography of the empire. And that seems kind of appropriate for a devoted official seeking to pass down something of himself. Personal recollection is partially translated into this shared experience by all the subjects of the realm. And a lot of the passages in this text, there seems to be a hesitation to put the focus on the author, even as he is everywhere hearing and seeing. Okay, flora and fauna were fun. The Flora Passage, he says, he begins by referring to the southern poet Lu You's little essay on an account of my residence, because it seems sort of similar, and you could see that they must have shared a lot of common interests. Lu You also wrote about his travels and what he saw and heard on them, and so he might have been influential in a number of ways. But Zhang Han here goes into great detail describing the flowers he grows outside of his window, season by season. And I can't really read this, although it would be sort of fun, but it's very detailed and it goes on at great length. In the first month in spring, you get Narcissus, and he tells you a little bit about each one. With their jade base and golden center, they are commonly called gold cup on silver stand. Their blue-green strips sway in the breeze, and their furtive fragrance sneaks up on one. Then there are plum blossoms of various colors. After that come two varieties of secluded cymbidium, both of them produced locally. The one with blossoms, one blossom in each stalk is called lan. The one with several blossoms on one stalk is called hui. And if it's the Fujian type, then one stem has 4 or 5, or even as many as 8 or 9. It's very detailed. And I always have a fun time going through these kinds of things. This one thing, I can't figure out what it is, tangdi, some sort of bush cherry or something, particularly pleasant to toy with in one's hand. Pines also have flowers, he notes, still for spring, yellow in color and powdery, mixed with honey to form cakes. The result is freshly fragrant and delicious. I'd kind of like to try that. As the parade of flowers marches through the seasons, one suspects the area outside my little window is a lot less modest than Zhang makes it sound. Or maybe this account of flora has spilled way beyond the bounds of his own garden and become a connoisseur's essay on the flora of the known world. But it's nonetheless posed as the view from his window. A vast botanical knowledge framed by this little bit of domestic architecture, as I'd been doing in my earlier essay. Fauna is linked to his travels, peacocks that he encountered in the south. He has an account of the elephants at the palace, all of which he notes are the color of mice rather than white. But I'm intrigued by this one on rabbits. Rabbits become pregnant by looking at the moon, because the moon has the gu rabbit. Its eyes are very bright. Today, people predict whether rabbits will be many or few using the full moon of the 8th month. On that night, deep in the lush mountain forest, hundreds of rabbits gather and stretch their necks toward the forest moon. If at that time the moon is bright, there will be a lot of rabbits that year. If it is obscured, there will be few. This is how they get pregnant, by receiving the qi of the rabbit in the moon. They give birth to their young by vomiting them out of their mouths. By nature, they are crafty and they are good at running. When hunters come to attack them, rabbits often leap out of their burrows, turn their heads to look behind them, and then head back into their burrows, and the hunters use this trait to catch them. I think it's safe to say that the part about them becoming pregnant by staring at the moon in herds of 100 in the forest is not something that falls into the category of things I have seen. Same with the vomiting the bunnies. It may well be among the things that Zhang Han has seen in texts. And I found that in the 3rd century, Zhang Hua speaks of rabbits becoming pregnant after licking their fur and looking at the moon, and then they vomit out their young later. But to draw on such a text would seem either beyond the sense of things seen and heard, or maybe it just makes the sense so broad that it's totally meaningless. I don't exactly know what to do with that. It does seem that there seem to be a lot of things contributing to a brief entry on rabbits, though, held together perhaps by nothing more than the assertion that these are things I have come to know. And maybe that's how we should think of this. And finally, the 2 sections that caught my eye originally, the one on dreams and the one on examination of self. The one on dreams does something that is somewhat common at this point. These are examination dreams. Sometimes you get examination anxiety dreams. These are predictive dreams. Try this one out. When I was a student, my classmate Li dreamt that the officials shaved the heads of several dozen new monks, of whom I was one. My name was 36th. I myself, on that day, dreamt of a green-faced demon, his hands offering a pair of red shoes, inside of which were written 36 names. Later, when I passed the provincial exam, my name was 49th. 4 times 9 is 36. When I was about to head north, I dreamt a man offered me 10 green coins, saying, "Cast them to the ground. If the majority come up tails, you win." I threw them down, and I got 6 tails. I threw them again, and I got 7. And the man said, "Numbers like those are sufficient." And when I passed the exam, I was in 42nd place. 6 times 7 can be how these dreams, one of the ways these dreams work. Unfortunately, the dreams section is cut off in the middle. The manuscript is missing the end of it, so we don't have that many, but they're all this kind of examination dreams, the ones that we have. The self-examination section is a little different than I had envisioned it. He begins with this little assertion that the gentleman trusts in right and wrong and does not trust in praise and blame. Praise and blame being one of the things the historian is supposed to do. And for this reason, it's hard for him to do wrong and not hard for him to do right, because he trusts in right and wrong. However, the world has those who see what is right in others but do not investigate their wrongs, and who see what is wrong in others but do not trust in what they do that is right. And then right can be made into wrong, and wrong can be made into right. It's a little cynical. But then when he goes into the examples of self-examination where I expect him to wrestle with his actions and that kind of thing, the moral implications or his moral progress, most of it is actually performance evaluations that various supervisors and censorial inspectors wrote of him. So there's a whole bunch of them from that period when he was in Luzhou, where he prayed for rain. In one of them, a Mr. Jia, who is the I don't remember which he is, regional inspector, praises Zhang's warm and upright nature, his outstanding conduct, his serving as a good model for lower level officers, his accomplishments in either cleaning out or punishing the corrupt, and his open-mindedness in hearing cases. And I suppose that quoting your performance evaluations is a kind of objective way of talking about your achievements and a sense of who you are. But I have to say I was a bit disappointed. I wanted him to talk about himself, and he doesn't very much. So what do we do with all this? Much of what I've outlined here makes it hard to place the松窗梦语in the conventional forms. It may function in part as a memoir, certainly seems to, while it in large part is constructed of material he became familiar with over the course of his long career and many postings to the four corners of the empire. The amount of information in many of the sections takes it away a long ways beyond reminiscences. To some degree, it resembles a modern American political memoir, which is not intended so much to reveal the person of its author as to explain how that person understood the political environment and the available means to deal with it. But no modern politician would think of organizing a memoir into subject categories. That would seem to remove all the narrative cause and effect that you want to have. So in this case, we have something like reminiscences expanded into a man's total knowledge. In its organization, with its implied claim to almost global coverage, it seems atypical of those things seen and heard biji of earlier eras, and some of the material does seem to derive from earlier texts. But let's return to the functions here. Zhang says he wanted to pass this down to later people and examine into himself at the same time. There is much recollecting of past actions as an official spread across many sections in the book, which would seem to serve both of those functions. There is much observation of customs and elephants and plants, and some depiction of his retirement retreat, and all that speaks to what this man's mind was drawn to. And there's a lot of stuff about material with which to assess him as a man, as an official, even if some of it is the performance reviews. But in the book's scope and careful organization and rich detail, it also becomes something useful to others, with a handy table of contents that makes it a kind of reference book. In short, it also serves the function of an encyclopedia. So something that looked somewhat like biji of things seen and heard leans into becoming an account not of what I saw and heard, but of what I came to know in this life. And just as in the travel sections, there's a tendency for Zhang, the traveler, to dissolve into the geography of the empire, in the book as a whole, there's something of a tendency for him to dissolve into that whole body of knowledge that his world posits the community of educated and broadly experienced literati officials hold and share. A sort of approximation of what there is to know. Is that entire body of knowledge, including the knowledge of how to act, the ultimate form of a sincere and capable scholar and public servant? Does a Zhang Han in the course of his long life become, to those who know him, the sum total of what he knows? Is the ultimate memoir, then, a record of the encyclopedic eye? Where does this松窗梦语lie in the knowledge landscape? Ben Elman talks about the Sung Neo-Confucians as having, seeing, on the one hand, this sort of programmatic investigation of things, and at the other pole, Bo-wu, the disaggregated, aimless erudition that they sort of denigrate. Is the neat structure of Zhang Han's book a sign of the possibility of comprehensive or totalized knowledge? Or, I began to think after a while, is it rather just the opposite? Isn't it an admission that in the inevitable absence of comprehensive knowledge, the best we can hope for is partial knowledge, conscientiously assembled with a good table of contents, so we can find things? And if the assembled knowledge of Zhang Han is accessible, does that not mean that he is accessible? Is the encyclopedia the perfect, if most audacious, framework for a memoir? Or, as an outward-oriented, rather public form, is it somehow also the erasure of that personal self, the dissolving of the personal self into the larger world of posterity? biji, encyclopedias, memoirs, something like this that seems to be a little bit of all of those. All of these imply wholes that they cannot quite encompass. And that brings me back to those metaphoric selves I started with, those things we all construct through implication without being able to retain all the particulars. So perhaps the frustrating, ambiguous form of the松窗梦语is about as far toward completeness as one can go in implying a self that one could pass down. I'm not really sure that it fulfills that goal better than the evocative moment held in the doorway of Guiyou Guang's studio in his little essay. But Zhang Han does still pose it within the frame of the pine window, after all. It's still a version of what I was looking at in those little vignettes taking place in little bits of architecture. I will end by saying my interest in memoirs comes from a simple chain of assertions. We live continuous lives. We don't really have any access to that continuity. We don't remember everything that we were doing at every moment. We construct narratives and compile data and save artifacts and souvenirs that together imply a life, a self, and so we are comfortable. It's the best we can do. It's all we can do. It's how we 做人, how we do human. And I'm always in the end interested in how other people do that. When I opened up the 松窗梦语 to the table of contents that day in my living room, it was its vision of how we might do human that held my eye. And I'll end there.